In the last section, we finished up our should continue function, which decides whether or not our event loop is going to run for one additional tick. We're now going to move to the body of our event loop. We're going to write out a series of comments that explain what occurs during every single tick. So these steps are occurring very, very quickly again and again and again. Let's write out the first step that occurs inside the event loop. So the first thing that happens here is node looks at pending timers. That's what we called it, right? Talking about this array up here, pending timers, and sees if any functions are ready to be called. So the very first thing that occurs is node looks at that array of pending timers, and it looks at all the different functions that have been passed to set timeout and set interval. If any of those timers have expired, then node calls the relevant callbacks associated with each one. So that's step number one. Let's also add in a little one here just to keep track. The next thing that happens is very similar to the first step. So for the second step here, node looks at pending OS tasks and pending operations and calls relevant callbacks. So in the second step, node will look at that collection of all the different tasks and operations, and if any of these things have been completed or any new events have been triggered, then node executes the relevant callbacks. Examples of these would be like the same examples that we laid out before. So for example, if some request comes into some port that a server is listening on, or if some file is successfully retrieved off of our computer's hard drive, then during this stage, node will detect that those things have been completed, and it will call the relevant callbacks, like the callback to receive a file that's been fetched, or a callback to handle an incoming request. So you can really consider these first two steps right here as where node does the bulk of its work and handles all the relevant callbacks. Now moving on to the third step is where things start to get a little bit more interesting. During step 3, node actually pauses execution temporarily. So we say pause execution. And during this pause, node just sits around and waits for new events to occur. So node just sits here, it pauses, and it says that I will continue whenever some number of events occur. And that is whenever a new pending OS task is done, whenever a new pending operation is done, or whenever a timer is about to complete. So during this pause phase, node decides that it's not going to just run through the event loop as fast as it possibly can. Remember that if you and I wrote out a while loop inside of JavaScript code and wrote in like say while true right here, something like this, that while loop would execute as fast as it possibly could. And that's not actually what occurs inside the event loop. Inside the event loop, this pause during step 3 just sits around and says, you know what, I've got no other work to do. I'm just going to wait until I see that a new pending task has been completed, like a new request has come in on some port that we're listening to. A new pending operation is completed, like we fetched some file off the hard drive, or a timer for one of the set timeouts and set intervals is about to expire and the relevant function needs to be called. So we just sit around and wait for that stuff to happen. Then, once that pause is complete, because we presumably see that something is about to occur, we then continue with the last two steps inside of the event loop. Step number 4 is very similar to step number 1. Up inside step number 1, you'll notice I had said that we're checking to see if any functions related to pending timers are called. And I used the words, I didn't actually write this out, but I had said set timeout and set interval. So this first step up here is about set timeout, set interval. During step number 4 down here, node again looks at pending timers. So again, look at pending timers. But in this case, node does not care about set timeout and set interval function calls. It only looks for functions that have been registered with set immediate. And remember, set immediate is very similar to set timeout and set interval, just in case you've never used it before. So look at pending timers, call any set immediate. And then finally, for step 5, and this one might be a little bit surprising, step 5 is to handle any close events. Now this one is a little bit harder to explain. So let me show you a very quick example. I'm going to open up a separate file here and I'll write out a very quick example for you to see. Okay, so an example of this would be if we use something like a standard object in the node library that events a close event. Now, one particular event or one particular object that does this is a read stream. If you've never worked with a read stream before, that's totally fine. Let me just write out the example and I think you'll very quickly understand what we're talking about. So if we had a read stream, we can register an event to run whenever this thing is about to close. And during that event trigger, we could do some cleanup work. So we might do a console log of like cleanup code. So we can listen to this close event, and anytime the event loop is about to finish, we can run some amount of cleanup code that maybe terminates any running servers or terminates any open files we have open or something like that. Essentially, this last step inside the event loop is about just handling cleanup code and cleaning up after ourselves and making sure that we don't have any dangling loose ends inside of our program. Okay, so that's it, the 5 steps that are executed during every execution of the event loop. This occurs during every single tick that occurs. And probably the most important thing to understand here is step number 3, the fact that we wait around and just wait for some amount or some event to occur rather than running through the event loop as fast as it possibly can. So that now that we've seen these 5 events that occur during the event loop, let's continue in the next section, and we're going to start to discuss some odds and ends around the event loop and also play around with some real code. So quick break, and I'll see you in just a minute.